Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and I'm just going to jump straight into it today. Gary Heidnik was born in Cleveland, Ohio on November 22nd, 1943, to parents Michael and Elaine Heidnik, the oldest of two, with younger brother Terry and parents that were both alcoholics. Their marriage was tumultuous. Both parties began having affairs before eventually getting divorced in 1946. During the custody arguments, Ellen claimed Michael was physically abusive to the boys and ended up winning full custody of them. The trio then moved to Eastlake, and while Ellen remarried, she continued her drinking habit. In school, Gary quickly became a fighter, but this only resulted in him being bullied more. While he struggled with interactions with his peers, he did well academically. In order to stay out of the sight of their mother, both Gary and Terry tended to stay outside as late as possible, particularly playing out in the woods. One day, Gary went to climb a tree when one of the tree branches broke off, causing him to fall, head down onto the earth below. The fall rendered him unconscious, fracturing his skull, and he laid that way for quite some time before his body went into a seizure. Terry then ran to his mother, and the two of them brought Gary back to the house and placed Gary into his bed. When the seizure stopped, Gary continued to be unconscious, and Ellen sat up with him, drinking, of course, throughout the night. In the morning, Gary awoke, but he couldn't speak. He needed to be fed, and he didn't know when he was going to the bathroom anymore. For days, he laid in bed, but he slowly increased his muscle coordination and ability to move. Since Ellen hadn't gotten medical help, Gary's head began to heal, though it remained misshapen from then on, to the point where, when he finally returned to school, he was often called quote-unquote football head. While he physically seemed to recover, mentally he was different, more withdrawn and less happy than he had been prior to his fall. He simply lost his empathy. Still, his intelligence did remain high, though he had more issues with school and his memory. School children eventually began to ignore him, and Gary did the same to them in response, preferring to be alone and avoid eye contact with others. If they didn't, he would rant at them about how they were less than him. He grew into a sense of superiority, a sentiment that continued at home. Gary would tell Ellen all the things she failed at as a mother. The two were emotionally and sometimes physically abusive to each other. Gary began doing whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. There was no structure in his life at all. And he's still a young boy, because by 7, Gary and Terry were both sent to live with Michael. By this time, Michael had also remarried and had given up the drink. When the boys arrived, both began acting defiantly, as Gary did in his mother's house before. Terry did so with such intensity that Michael slapped him so hard he burst Terry's eardrum. Michael didn't care for Gary's antics either, but both boys were given strict structure and harsh discipline. Sometimes that seemed to work, especially for Gary. He did better at his father's house and his new school. Michael came down hard on Gary for his continued bedwetting, however, which would cause Gary increased anxiety and then in turn increase his instances of said bedwetting. Michael would force him to air his sheets out from the window, though not wash them, just put them out to dry, causing him to smell of urine and embarrass him further, even at school. The whole thing became a vicious cycle until Michael, in a fit of rage one day, strung Gary out on the window during one of these episodes. But he realized the entire neighborhood could see the event and were likely now judging him. He ended up calming down on the torture of Gary, which then in turn eased Gary's anxiety and lessened the episodes of bedwetting. As Gary transitioned into his teenage years, he began requesting that Michael send him to military school, partially because he was aware structure helped him, but also to get away from the abuse at home. Eventually, he won his father over and went to Staunton Military Academy. And around the same time, Gary's mother had gotten her life together. She was stable and married and had returned to the boys' lives. With that, Terry went back to live with his mother, and both boys left the abuse of their father behind. The 14-year-old Gary flourished at Staunton Military Academy at first. He lived for the structure the academy provided, fit in with his peers, and when the academy performed an IQ test, Gary realized he was in the top portion, above his peers. He scored 148 for reference and was considered genius level. But this score was part of his downfall within the academy. Gary started feeling a sense of superiority and would often find ways to shirk off his responsibilities, either getting others to shoulder the burden of the work, something that over time caused a rift with his peers. And then, a year before graduation, Gary simply dropped out of school and moved back in with his mother and brother. Though he was back at home, all sources report that he had minimal contact with his mother and brother. He returned to the high school and graduated without making any social connections with his peers. From high school, he did actually go back and join the military, realizing he did once again better with structure, especially that he had at the military academy. He signed on to be a medic and qualified as a combat medic quickly. From there, he was assigned to Germany at the 46th Army Surgical Hospital on the Landstuhl base. There, he completed minor surgeries and procedures with efficiency and ease. While he started to find his stride, Gary got sick. In the beginning, he suffered from headaches, worsening to the point where he would basically be blinded and unable to focus. The pain moved to his stomach, but he convinced himself it was stress and failed to seek medical attention. Finally, after recurrent episodes, he did make an appointment and got checked out. He was diagnosed with gastroenteritis. Something going around the base after a bacterial contaminant was noted in the food. Apparently, it was pretty normal in the food. However, locals don't react because their gut is used to it. It's just when new soldiers come in that their body isn't immune to it. He was given antibiotics, but during his examination, delving deeper into these headaches that he was having, doctors began to notice something else. Gary had something that they had called at the time, quote, a blunted affect, end quote. He didn't understand human emotion, a characteristic which is often noted in those who suffer from schizophrenia. Concerns of his mental health weren't brushed off. He was given stelazine, an antipsychotic, which could also have the side effect of assisting with headaches. After weeks, he felt better, and when he went back for a follow-up thinking he was going back to work, he found out he was headed back to the U.S. for further testing. Gary was sent to Philadelphia to the Veterans Hospital. There, multiple doctors poked and prodded. They took blood tests, did exams, and asked as many questions as they could. After all that, his original diagnosis from Germany was pretty much upheld. He was a schizophrenic. As a result of being confirmed to have a mental health diagnosis, he was honorably discharged and barred from re-enlisting the military. The then 19-year-old Gary stayed in Philadelphia and enrolled in the local university to study to become a doctor. He also filled out paperwork and completed some testing to prove his medical knowledge, which allowed him to become a licensed nurse practitioner where he could work while he was going to school. He planned to supplement his GI income, again, while working. That was his plan, but it really didn't go well. University doesn't require the same type of structure, and as a result, Gary dropped out after a single semester. Gary worked at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Coatesville and was bored and irritable. Eventually, due to multiple issues, he had to be let go. From there, he ended up working in a mental institution. It was the only place that took him without checking for references. He began 12-hour shifts of medicating those with mental health issues at a time where most were medically restrained. It's a term many of us healthcare field people called snowing. They use so much medication that basically the individual's incapable of acting out, especially violently. The result was Gary's first suicide attempt while working at the hospital. Unfortunately, the staff recognized the missing medication immediately, and Gary was found and resuscitated immediately as well, going from staff to a patient until he was stable enough to discharge. Obviously, he couldn't return to work, so for the next 8 years, Gary attempted suicide 12 more times after being unable to find work and stability. Then, in 1970, It wasn't Gary to be successful, but instead, it was Ellen. Ellen was diagnosed with cancer that had metastasized to her bones. On Mother's Day, she took her kitchen supplies, poured them into a mug, and walked into the basement. She was found by her husband the next day. Surprisingly, this is what convinced Gary to try and turn his life around. No, not out of love, but rather spite. He didn't want to go out like someone he thought so little of. From there, Gary decided that he should start his own church in order to gain money, power, and respect. He filled out all the forms, gathered a small following, and started preaching from his home on Sundays. After slowly increasing his gathering and obtaining sufficient funds, he was fully qualified as the Church of the United Ministers of God in October of 1971. From there, he funneled the money from the church into high-risk investments. After they paid off, he began to buy homes, convince his church members to repair them to house the homeless, and then, of course, instead became a landlord, eventually resulting in steady income and quite a surplus of money. After he amassed a great amount of wealth, he focused on creating a legacy through heirs. While at first he used his position to sexually abuse the young black girls in his congregation, he realized they were smart enough that there would be consequences if he got any of them pregnant. Instead, he focused on the girls with mental disabilities. Yep, you heard that correctly. The first girl he impregnated was a girl named Gail. He kept her at his home until just before she went into labor. Gary got annoyed with her when she complained of too much pain, however, and sent her to be home with family. Of course, family brought her to the hospital where she gave birth. As she was deemed incapable of raising a child and Gary didn't show, the child was given up to the state. The next woman was Anjanette, for which Gary decided he would keep her at home and ensure that the birth occurred there, where he could make sure the child wouldn't be given away, believing his previous medical experience would guide him through the birthing process. When her labor seemed too much, however, Gary relented and took Anjanette to the hospital. Instead of announcing he was the father, he went as, of course, her bishop. As such, he was not in the room during the birth and didn't realize that once again the baby would be taken away until it was already done. After his second failure, Gary thought he needed someone who wouldn't be noticed if there was complications and they didn't make it through the birthing process. And Jeanette happened to have a sister who was ripe for the picking. Alberta was a couple years younger than Anjanette, and her disability was so much that she was living in a mental institution at the time. One day in mid-1978, he loaded Anjanette into the car and went to the institution. With a relative there, staff gave Alberta a day pass to visit her sister, and the three piled into the car and went to Gary's home, where he had set up a space for Alberta. By space, I mean he went to the basement and put a bucket for her to use, piled some rags together and called it a bed, then added a padlock to the outside of the door. On day one, he gave the girls candy and ice cream, letting them stay up late into the night. After taking Anjanette to bed, he brought Alberta to the basement to show her her space or her bed. There, of course, he sexually assaulted her, something she likely didn't understand due to her capacity. And then he simply went back upstairs to Anjanette. In the morning, once again, the girls were given all the sweets they wanted. In the evening, he gave them alcohol. When they were drunk, he tucked Anjanette in and again took Alberta downstairs and sexually assaulted her. This time he stayed down there, assaulting Alberta multiple times throughout the night. In the morning, he came upstairs and locked the door behind him. For weeks, Alberta stayed in the basement, and Gary would sexually assault both girls, now under his roof. But he didn't count on the institution tracking him down, and they eventually did, showing up with both staff and police. Reports state Gary simply opened the door, unlocked the basement, and let Alberta out. She was barely verbal when she arrived at Gary's and was nonverbal when she left, something that persisted for quite some time. Alberta had obviously been scared and confused, and back at the hospital, when she received a medical examination, it was clear why. She had been both anally and vaginally raped, and Gary had passed on gonorrhea to her. Charges were pressed. Gary was arrested, and Anjanette was returned to her parents as well. Gary insisted it was simply a misunderstanding. At trial, defense claimed They wouldn't be able to prove, in fact, that it was Gary and not simply one of the other plethora of people that had been in the girls' lives, including male staff, congregation members, police officers, etc. In the end, Gary was convicted and sent to prison. I'd like to say this is as bad as it gets, that this is where justice prevailed and he spent the rest of his life in prison. I'd like to, but I cannot. Immediately, defense filed appeals. In months, his appeals resulted in an overturned sentence, though part of the sentence being overturned was due to the presentation of Gary's own mental health. He was, after all, discharged from the military for it and remained on high-dose antipsychotic medications. Therefore, he may not have been able to fully grasp the gravity of his own depravity. The courts moved him from prison to a mental institution for treatment. Gary ended up staying 3 years at institutions before eventually being released back into society under the belief that he was medically stable enough to be a functioning member of society. In April of 1983, he was free from monitoring and the institutions. He sold his old house and bought a trailer to sleep in until he found a new home. He still had his properties and investments that had been sitting idle along with his cars parked in a safe area, so he was not down and out. But he did need to rebuild much of his life, in a sense. He found his new home on 3520 North Marshall Street in North Philadelphia, in an area close to city center. He went back to his congregation to find none of them knew why the Bishop Gary was gone for so long. The family of the girl simply up and left town without saying a word, so the community was really none the wiser. He still had his flock, and Gary thought it was time to try and get a real wife now that he had everything else sorted out. One that he could have children and keep this time. He dated, but found most women didn't want to be a traditional stay-at-home mom, obedient wife anymore. After failing that route, Gary went through a matrimonial matchmaking service and was given the information of a woman in the Philippines, Betty Disto. The two wrote back and forth for 2 years and then met in September of 1985. Gary paid for her to fly to the U.S., and after a month together, the two married in Maryland. A week later, they were home in Philadelphia. At first, Gary enjoyed having a wife. His house was clean, and Betty didn't refuse any of his requests sexually. After months, though, he felt bored and started having affairs, then began bringing women home. His escalation continued to the point where he'd make Betty watch as he slept with other women. Still, he found this wasn't enough. He didn't feel satisfied. He wanted something more. Months later, Gary realized it was breaking Betty that made him satisfied, not anything else. So the affairs stopped. But the beatings began. He was abusive and demanded perfection. Betty suffered in the home, but outside of the home began to make friends. Friends that eventually put her in touch with a Filipino community. See, Betty had no money and no means to get away, but the community came together and found a way to help her. And one day, in 1986, Gary came home to an empty house. Betty was gone, her ring left on the table. Gary was mad, but the situation became worse when he received a letter for child support for their son, Jesse John Disto. His mental stability, what little he had, broke. He stopped taking his medication. Gary had sex workers over all the time, many of whom would run after their encounters with him. He closed his blinds and would shoot BBs at anyone who tried to park in front of their house. Gary's paranoia took over. Around the same time, 2 plainclothes detectives knocked on Gary's door. After a short conversation, he went with them to the station where he phoned a lawyer. Before Betty left, she made a solid case back with evidence of Gary's crimes. This time, he was arrested for assault, indecent assault, spousal rape, and involuntary deviant intercourse. Eventually, Gary took a plea, and by the time everything was settled, he served a few months before being released on probation. However, his time in jail and prison wasn't really too terrible for him. He found structure again and took his medication and was stable. Upon his release, he went back to his home, and aside from visiting parishioners and holding church ceremonies, he continued renovations. He worked on the basement. See, he was shoveling the dirt floor until he could create a pit. Based on his history, I think most of us can brace for the information that's coming next. On November 25th, 1986, Gary drove around in his Coupe de Ville looking for just the right girl. At 11 p.m., he picked up Josephina or Joe Rivera. They drove around discussing prices, then went to Gary's house after settling. After going to the bedroom, they had intercourse, but when Josephina went to redress after performing her services, Gary strangled her. She woke up handcuffed, and after he threatened her, he walked her down to the basement. He placed shackles on her ankles, secured them with a bolt, and then superglued that bolt. Gary explained to Josephina that he wanted a woman to produce children with, that if she was good and he could trust her, she would come out of the pit and be upstairs. But if she wasn't, she was going to stay in the pit. After being placed in the pit, he covered the pit with boards, then material to keep the boards down. When Josephina cried out, he beat her. Then he left her in the pit overnight. The next day he brought her crackers and water and let her stretch, but was put back in the pit quickly. And when she protested, he beat her with a board until she stopped. The next day she remained in the pit without food or water, ended up soiling the dirt. The day after, Gary came down, removed her from the pit, put her in the corner, and he dug the pit down further, removing the soilage as he went. Then he fed her a turkey sandwich and put her back in the hole, wishing her a happy Thanksgiving. Before, it wasn't deep enough to stand, but when he had dug it out, she was able to stand and felt thankful for her not being stuck in a cramped position. But the fact that he's making the pit bigger just means worse things are to come. The next day, Gary found 25-year-old Sandy Lindsay, a developmentally delayed woman who would sometimes go to church with Gary. They often met at McDonald's, so Sandy believed they were friends. Sandy was having menstrual cramps and told her mother she was going to the store to get some pain relief medication. As she was walking, Gary drove by and offered her a ride. She accepted, and after telling him where she was going, he offered her better medication, of course at his home. Again, she accepted. From there, she was brought in and immediately coaxed into the basement. She met Joe, and Gary explained about having babies, that Sandy was going to help so they could have lots of babies before undressing her and shackling her in the same way as Joe. He brought down food for both women and then left them in the dark. Joe and Sandy ate, and Joe immediately fell asleep from exhaustion. In the meantime, Tracy Lomax, Sandy's sister, was worried. After an hour, she had the neighborhood out looking for Sandy. Searched through the weekend, and on Monday, they knew they needed to get police involved, calling Detective Julius Armstrong. But Detective Armstrong was an idiot, because Sandy was 25, and he didn't see the concern. After all, she was capable enough to hold a job, so even though she was mentally disabled, he didn't think that it was serious. So he took down the information and did absolutely nothing. Tracy, however, didn't let that rest. She went looking for Sandy's friend, Tony. Tony also went to Gary's church and met with Sandy at McDonald's many times. Tony said that a man had taken interest in Sandy recently. A man named Gary, and he had his number. Tracy called his house, and when asked where Sandy was, he replied, quote, "No, not here," end quote, then hung up. That was enough to get Tracy to his house. And don't forget, he still holds church services there, so Tony knows this address. When he refused to answer, she spoke with neighbors, and one lady confirmed seeing Sandy enter his house recently. Tracy contacted the wonderful Detective Armstrong. He too did actually go down to the address and knocked, but again, Gary didn't answer, and so he simply left his card and instructions to call him at the door. Obviously, Gary didn't call. Then a Christmas card came from Sandy to the family's door with $20 inside, postmarked from New York. The police took it as a sign that Sandy left of her own volition and was starting over in New York. Not that maybe something else happened and they should continue looking into Gary. That's fine. We just let that go. Not that Philadelphia is close to New York or anything. Anyway, next, he found Lisa Thomas just before Christmas. He took her out on a date and bought her some things, then offered to take her home for some more beers. She accepted, and the two went to Gary's. There, the pattern followed much as it had before. They went upstairs, and immediately after sex, he began to choke her. She begged and said she would do whatever he wanted instead of being choked out. So he got out the handcuffs, cuffed her, and brought her to the basement. There, she met the two women in the pit, was fitted with her ankle shackles, and explained how things would go from then on. The women were fed crackers, stale bread, and dog food. On New Year's Day, Debbie was brought down. She cried more than the others, to the point where the other women started to avoid her. She was beaten much harder into submission. On January 18th, Jacqueline Askins, known as Donna at the time, was added to the basement. With all the women he wanted in the basement, he set to raping them daily, making sure to attack all of them. After all, he wanted children. He started allowing them out of the pit at times, again using his good behavior system. Soon it was apparent that Jo was the best of the best. She made it to the top. She was the most obedient, to the point where Gary made her dole out punishments to the other girls. Gary also didn't want to change his daily life, however, meaning that, like I just said, his congregation of people were above these women weekly. In order to prevent the women from hearing them and calling out, Gary attempted to destroy their eardrums. He did this by driving a screwdriver into their ears. All except for Jo. Sandy ended up being Gary's most difficult girl. She had physical disabilities that made things challenging. When they were given food, Gary expected them to eat swiftly. But Sandy had a problem with her jaw that slowed her down. Gary would take a board with nails and beat her in the head with it. When she still couldn't finish her food on time, Gary decided she needed to be made an example of, and so he strung her to a pine board on the ceiling by her handcuffs. There, he had Jo beat her until she stopped crying. The other women were moved to the pit and Jo was brought upstairs. Sandy was left strung up for 3 days. When Gary shouted at her at the third day, Sandy didn't respond. Sandy had died. The other women were let out of the pit briefly to see what would happen if you disobeyed, then placed back in. Jo was forced to help bring Sandy upstairs before being put in the basement as well. Then the sound of an electric saw started, followed by an odor so foul police were eventually called by neighbors. When they arrived, Gary stated he had accidentally badly burnt a roast and he apologized. Meanwhile, the women in the basement were mentally faring worse. Debbie began talking back, and after a few days, Gary took her out of the basement to, quote, explain a few things to her, end quote. After hours, she was back in the basement in a catatonic state, where she remained for days before the others could find out why. She said Sandy's head was in a boiling pot of water. Her ribs were in a casserole. Her limbs were in the freezer. He was combining it with the dog food and feeding it to the women. They ate Sandy for a month. On March 18th, Gary left the girls in the basement, but loose, while he left and returned to hear them all screaming. Jo was at the basement door apologizing and saying it wasn't her fault. Gary was angry. He got a hose and watered down the pit. He went to the wall and removed a power socket, systematically electrocuting each of the women. Everyone fell into line after that. Everyone except Debbie. Debbie kept screaming, right up until he electrocuted her for minutes at a time, until she went silent, until she slumped into the water, until he had killed her. Then he told Jo to get a pad of paper and a pen. After that, he wrote out a confession that Jo had killed Debbie and made her sign it. Gary took Jo and part of Debbie out to a national park and told Jo that's where Debbie would be dumped, all except the parts that would make her identifiable. Gary now didn't have the numbers he wanted, so on March 24th, 1987, he put the girls in the pit and brought Jo to the car. She was going to help him find new women. Jo spotted Agnes Adams, a working girl she knew. They chatted and she got in the car. She was brought back to the house, and Joe sat at the dining table as Gary set about his normal routine. It went so well that after Agnes was in the pit, Gary set out to do the same thing that night. He wanted both women replaced. So the two went out again, and Joe had him pull into a gas station this time, telling him she knew a girl that lived just up the way, but it wouldn't work if Gary showed up with her, that she'd likely be spooked. He said, quote, "Yeah, you've earned my trust," end quote, and let her out. Joe walked until she was out of his sight, and then sprinted home. She told her boyfriend what happened. He said he thought that she just up and left him, and he didn't believe Joe. So she left, went to a payphone, called 911, and relayed her story. Again, they didn't believe her. But they did send an officer out to make sure it wasn't just a prank call. Even when they saw her, police weren't entirely convinced. But she showed him her shackle marks and gave Gary's address and the vehicle that he was sitting at, the gas station, that they would find women chained up and a dead body at the house. So Officer Savage and Cannon went to the gas station, where Gary was in fact waiting, exactly in the car she described, and they took him into custody. He wasn't under arrest at this time. They just wanted to see if they could get more information, which might potentially corroborate Joe's story. Gary immediately lawyered up. Officer Cannon and Lieutenant Hansen brought Joe to Gary's house and entered with the key Gary had entrusted to Joe. Inside, they found the women in the basement and the body parts in the freezer. In total, police found 27 pounds of body parts. The fire department was brought out to unshackle the girls, and one officer realized there was a pot of boiling water on the stove. Inside, they found Debbie's head. Jacqueline would later say, quote, "Me upstairs to the bathroom, and he said, 'We all got to play a part in this.' I said, 'Play a part in what?' He had me cut her limb, like her arm," end quote. Obviously, Gary was officially arrested, and at an arraignment tried to claim the women were simply already in his house when he moved in, because that's feasible. In April, he tried to hang himself, quite unsuccessfully. The defense claimed their client was insane, and in return, prosecution brought up every other aspect of his life, including how he managed his investment portfolio to prove the fact that he was sane. And now this is going to be a long quote from Justia Law, but it's directly from his court paperwork on what the actual rebuttal to his sanity was. Quote, 1. Ernestine Simpson, a social worker at a state hospital in New Jersey, testified that she interviewed appellant in the fall of 1986 in order to determine whether appellant was sufficiently responsible to escort a patient, appellant's ex-wife, off hospital grounds. Ms. Simpson determined that appellant was sufficiently responsible and recalled that she viewed appellant as being neat, clean, courteous, calm, rational, and intelligent. 2. Robert Kirkpatrick, appellant's stockbroker since 1974, testified that appellant was an astute investor who had raised his portfolio from $1,500 to $531,702, and that appellant had last placed an order for a purchase of stock on November 17, 1986. 3. Shirley Carter, an acquaintance of appellant since 1978, testified that she had conversed with appellant in October and November of 1986. She testified that appellant's behavior appeared to be the same as it had been over the previous 8 years. 4. Harold Wexler, a court reporter who had recorded proceedings involving appellant in family court in January of 1987, read the entire transcript of these family court proceedings to the within jury. The within trial court, in its opinion, in support of its order denying appellant's post-trial motions, characterized appellant's behavior during family court proceedings as cunning and deceptive in answering questions about his true worth and his obligation to support his wife and son, both of whom were on welfare. 5. David Pliner, a car salesman who recalled appellant coming to his showroom in November 1986 to purchase a Cadillac, testified that appellant acted just like any other customer and that the appellant had offered him advice on investing. 6. Richard W. Hull, MD, a psychiatrist at the Veterans Outpatient Clinic in Philadelphia, testified that in December 1986, appellant, who had last been seen by Dr. Hull in February 1986, asked to have his treatment reinstated. Appellant denied having any psychiatric symptoms such as anxiety, hallucinations, depressions, or delusions. Dr. Hole, nevertheless, prescribed Thorazine, a tranquilizer widely used in managing schizophrenia, although he saw no ongoing problems at that time or when appellant returned in January and February of 1987. 7. Eva Wojciechowski, a court psychologist, testified that she had administered an intelligence test to appellant incidental to his attempt to gain partial custody of his son in March of 1987. Appellant's test showed that his IQ was 148. She testified that appellant's score placed him in the upper one-half of 1% of the total population. End quote. So again, we have plenty of people saying that he is completely sane and his insanity plea, therefore, was not accepted. Judge Lynn Abraham presided over the trial in 1988, where Gary was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, 6 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of rape, 4 counts of aggravated assault, and 2 counts of involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. Of the trial, Judge Abraham stated, quote, "I very quickly realized in my mind he was faking to affect mental illness." End quote. At sentencing, he received death. After a year in the State Correctional Institution in Pittsburgh, he once again attempted suicide and failed. Ultimately, Gary Heidnik was put to death at the Rockview State Correctional Facility in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, on July 6, 1999. And if the pit information sounds vaguely familiar, Gary was the unfortunate inspiration for Buffalo Bill in the Silence of the Lambs movie. And that is the end of Gary Heidnik. To all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.